The story of Moses is one that, if we've been around church for a while, we'll know the story fairly well. And he really is set up there as certainly an inspirational figure, a pivotal figure in the history of Israel. And we see so much in this story. It's such a great story of God's faithfulness, of God using someone to achieve amazing things. So the story of Moses as a great historical event in the history of Israel is something that's amazing and something that inspires us. But we can also feel disconnected from the story. That seems so out of this world and such a long time ago, and what Moses encountered and what he experienced, the clear magnitude of God's miracle working power through him, and all that he endured just seems so otherworldly that we don't feel really connected from Moses. And that's why it's so important to remember, as you often hear me say, how important it is that as Christians, when we read the Old Testament, we look at it through a New Testament lens. As we read the story of the Old Covenant, we must do so through a New Covenant lens, because when we do that, Moses' story becomes our story. Moses is not someone who was extra special, someone who was almost superhuman, but Moses' life is reflected in yours and my life through the lens of Jesus, and through what we sung earlier about the cross of Calvary. The Lord unites our story with the story of Moses. And that's what I want to unpack a bit more today. In Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1, it talks about the law is the shadow of the things to come. The law, the Old Covenant, was a shadow of the reality that came into being through the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. So this here is a shadow. The story of Moses is a shadow of the reality that we lived. Let's just pack it up and unpack it. Not pack it up, unpack it. To see what we can, verse by verse almost today, to hear, okay, what can we hear? What can we learn? How does this story intersect from our story? And the first thing we learn is the background to this. If we read chapters 1 and 2 of Exodus, what led up to this, the first thing we read is that Moses really mucked it up big time. The story was he was a Hebrew child at the time where the Pharaoh was demanding that all babies born be killed. And you might know the story that Moses' mother hid him in the bulrushes in a manger that she'd made, floated it down the river. Pharaoh's daughter found him and nurtured him, and he became like her son and lived in the house of Pharaoh himself. So that gave Moses, a Hebrew, the opportunity to be someone of incredible influence. But he mucked it up in a rush of blood when he saw Hebrew being mistreated by an Egyptian. He killed him. There's no excuse for murder anywhere, anytime. So he mucked it up. Pharaoh found out it was after his blood, so he ran away. Land of Midian, married one of the priest's daughters, and was there at the time of the burning bush incident looking after the flock of his father-in-law. So Moses had messed up. But it didn't stop God from calling him out and calling him and equipping him to do an amazing thing which affected the history of God's people. That's the first thing we learn today. No matter how much, and remember today, no matter how much we mess up, no matter how much we may feel as if we've let God down, which we all have, no matter how many times we feel we test God's grace, God never gives up. God is interested in our present and our future, not our history. In this world, in the kingdom of this world, our history can often negate our future because we are judged on the basis of our history. God doesn't judge us on the basis of our history. Through the grace of God on the cross of Calvary, our history does not define our present and our future. That is one of the things that brings us such great hope as the people of God, because this world does. We are judged on our performance in the past. And one of the things as the people of God that gives us great hope is knowing that our past does not and cannot define us because of the grace of God. That was evidenced here clearly, even in the story of Moses. Right back then, we see God's grace and God's faithfulness evidence here. So that's the first thing we learn. But let's get into the story. Let's just go here again what happened. So Moses there, the first couple of verses was keeping his flock, and then he noticed this bush that was burning but wasn't burning up. So what do we learn here? Moses was doing what he did every day. He was just doing his ordinary work, tending the flock. And in the midst of the ordinary, God showed up. God showed up, and God got his attention for something that was out of the ordinary in the midst of the ordinary. The burning bush, out of the ordinary in the midst of the ordinary. God is still sending burning bushes our way today. It's often hard to hear them. You know, I often thought of this, the Jesus on Twitter thing. I thought, we are in such information overload in this day. Much as I do the social media thing or some of it, it's like we're in just constant overload. We're constantly connected to information, aren't we? Emails, social media, 24/7 news channel. There's just so much happening, so much white noise out there that it is more and more difficult to stop and listen. And now people are realising it's fascinating. If you go to the corporate world now, one of the most popular things of corporate executives is learning to meditate, learning meditation, because they realise the need to slow down and be more present in the now. God knows that, but God will still send burning bushes our way. They may not be as bizarre as a literal burning bush, but we've got to learn to recognise the things that are out in the ordinary, and they may be God trying to get our attention. It just could be a left field contact with someone you haven't heard of from years. Maybe it was just someone you know very well doing something out of the ordinary, unexpected. Maybe it's just even listening to a sermon on Sunday and hearing something completely different than everyone else seems to hear. Maybe it's just something in your life in the air that just is not going with the flow of the normal. It could be an urging from left field. If you've ever had just a thought totally from left field, where did that come from? And, you know, don't just write it off and think, okay, that's bizarre. Okay. Test it out. It could very well be a burning bush. It could be the Lord trying to get your attention. As I look back, I can just think of, over the years, many, many burning bushes that God sent my way. I thought of in Easter 1982, where in my final year at uni, where I had full intention of working as a chartered accountant here in Brisbane, and I I just read an ad in the Australian for graduate accountants in the Auditor General's office in Canberra, and it wouldn't leave me alone. This was not part of my plan. I just tried to put it aside, but it wouldn't go. I now see it was part of God's plan, because it was moving to Canberra and the involvement in the church that I had there that I heard the call to ministry. That was all part of God's plan. When I was in Canberra, I still planned to work there and build a career in the public service, except I saw an ad in my local church newspaper for a lay preacher's course. I'd never, ever, ever considered anything like that before, but it just thinks I need to do this. Little did I know, that was all part of God's plan, this total left field. What are you thinking about, Mark? This is not part of your plan. At the end of 2010, when a friend of mine just said, I've started to train as a life coach, and suddenly a light went on. That wasn't part of my thinking before then. All these times, what about you? How often has just something come across your path, a thought, something was said to you, something you've thought, an idea that wasn't just in your thinking and your plans at all? Don't ignore it. It could very well be a burning bush. It could be the Lord trying to get your attention. in the midst of the busyness of everyday life. He may be something that he wants to say to you. Let's listen and look for the burning bushes. Just because it's not something dramatic like a physical burning bush, remember, it happened in the midst of Moses' ordinary everyday life. How's God speaking to you? Where are the burning bushes? What are the burning bushes that may have come your way and he may bring in the future? So let's look what happened then. Moses responded, and the Lord said, "Okay, Moses, don't come any closer and take off your shoes. You're on holy ground." When we think of that experience and the holy ground, we think of it, don't we, in the Old Testament context of the glory clouds, the clouds on the mountain, the fire led by fire by day and cloud by night, and all of those are dramatic examples. Solomon's temple and the glory cloud rolled in. Wow, this is holy ground. And it was. And that just seems to us to be an out-of-the-ordinary experience. Jesus levelled that when on the cross of Calvary, the veil of the temple was torn in two, because the temple was where the inner court of the temple, that was holy ground. That was where the presence of God was. The veil tore from top to bottom when Jesus died, giving a powerful prophetic message. My presence is no longer hidden. My presence is available to all. Everyone who's been standing in the outer court, women, those who weren't the right religion, those who weren't right stock, those who weren't right breeding, God's presence was open to all. Holy ground is everywhere. There is one of the things that Jesus did is he tore the veil between sacred and secular. There is a false distinction between, we use that term sacred and secular. It is a false dichotomy, friends. It's a false distinction. And what happens is when we make it that, when we make church holy, sacred, the world secular, we are sewing up that veil again. When we make our own holy ground, this is holy ground, and when we step out there, we're on earthly ground, we are in fact sewing up the veil. Everywhere is holy ground. Jesus tore the veil away, and when Pentecost poured out his Spirit on all flesh, that means everywhere God is present. So wherever we are, in our families, in our workplaces, in our neighbourhoods, in our community groups, God is there. And when we choose to see it as holy ground, we will be more open to God speaking to us through those situations, or giving us a message or a call or a missionary assignment to those situations. Do you understand what I'm saying? Our call to be missionaries as followers of Jesus means that everywhere we go, there are opportunities to serve. One of the real revelations that really came for me, probably about more than 20 years ago now, is one of the great things. I'll take a step back. One of the wonderful things that happened in the church in about the 60s and the 70s with the outpouring of the charismatic renewal movement, as we began to see how we're all equipped for ministry. It wasn't just the pastor or the priest that was called to ministry, but we could all be called to ministry. But the trouble is, the way that happened was ministry was seen as that happened in the church. Some were called to be teachers. Some were called to have a healing ministry. Some were called to lead children's ministry. Some youth ministry. So we started to say ministries for everyone, but in the church. Okay? Yeah, you're called to be witnesses in the world, but ministry happens within the church. And it's no. Wherever we are and what we do, as the people of God, we are called to ministry through our vocations, through where God has called us to be. Everyone is called to ministry. I remember when I was studying for my doctorate of ministry degree quite many years ago now, and as part of the study group, the teacher, the lecturer who was taking this subject, brought other people in to talk to us about ministry. This was about ministry as a whole of life. And I remember hearing from a great young Christian lawyer, and he was just lamenting. He really was called, God called him to serve as a lawyer. And yet he said, I got no support from my church. All they want me to do is serve on the board and be on the youth group and do all these things. He says, you know, I work 60 to 70 hours a week. I can't do that. My time and Sunday is a time to be refreshed and renewed for ministering the world. But they don't see that. And I've been judged, I've been called, I've been carnal, I'm not taking up my ministry. See what happens when we segregate it out? Wherever you are fulfilling your call to ministry, whether working in whatever vocation, whether retired and now connecting with your family and community. There it is, holy ground where you are called to minister. Now, bear with me. That was a bit of a sidetrack, so I'll just get back on track. Okay, so what happened then? So the Lord began to talk to Moses. And he says, this is holy ground. And he says, okay, he says, and this is what the Lord said. Moses, I have seen the oppression of my people, and I have come to deliver them. And what was God talking about? He was talking about the oppression of the people of Israel by the nation of Egypt. He was talking about a physical oppression where they were literally slaves to the Egyptians. And he says, I have come to set them free. And the voice of God is still speaking out to his servants today, you and me, followers of Jesus, and God is still saying, I have seen the oppression of my people and I have come to deliver them. He is saying that to you and I. Yes, in this part of the world, we don't see, thank God, slavery anymore, but we are living in the midst of an oppressed people. Whether they be spiritually oppressed, psychologically oppressed, physically oppressed by any way, the Lord is saying, I have seen the oppression of my people. Intellectually oppressed, emotionally oppressed. I don't even have to give examples because you see it day by day where you are. People who are broken, people who don't have hope, people who are battling anxiety, depression, and a whole other range of mental illnesses. People who are oppressed by their own bad choices and are languishing under a burden of condemnation. The message of the Lord to them when the world is judging them and the world is condemning them and the world is wanting to write them off because they've messed up, the voice of the Lord through his servants is, I have seen the oppression of my people and I have come to deliver them. And that's the same message that he's given to you and me through Jesus. And as he said, Moses, I want you to instigate this whole show. I'm going to set them all free. And you're going to instigate it. And this is what you're going to do. You're going to go up and talk to the Pharaoh. So we move on to the next one. Moses suddenly is feeling quite oppressed himself, oppressed by a burden of intimidation. So he says, who am I to do this? And this is where we so easily can identify with Moses. So often we can not only underestimate our own capacity, but more importantly, we underestimate God's capacity to work through us. The majority of people are very aware of their own limitations. But what we often fail to remember is what the Lord can do through us. Moses, at the thought of fronting up to the king, the Pharaoh of Egypt, that was an overwhelming thought for him, because he looked at him, his qualities that he perceived he had, the talents and the abilities he perceived he did not have, and has said, who am I to do this? But you see, the Lord wasn't looking at Moses' inabilities. The Lord was focusing on what he was going to do through him. We believe we don't have the gifts or the talents to do amazing things. God is not looking at our abilities. He's looking at our obedience. As it was then, so it is today. Just as God is alighting some bushes to get, just as God alighted a bush to get Moses' attention, God is going to be speaking to us, has been and is speaking to us out of the ordinary, looking for our attention. And he wants to do some extraordinary things through us right where we are. Yes, he sends some people to the other side of the world. Yes, he sends some people, absolutely, to change careers and vocations and start different things. But where you are now, or where he has called you to be now, you're called to ministry. Right there. The Lord is unfolding a mission field right there. And you see, that may not be overt. Again, we misunderstand. Oh, does that mean that I've got to start witnessing to others and start sharing Bible verses and giving out tracts? Well, yes, if the Lord prompts you to do that, yes. But here's the important thing. If the Lord's not prompting you to do that, that could cause more harm than good. The first thing he wants you to do is actually build a relationship with those around you. He wants you to get to know them, to listen to their story. One of the big mistakes that fervent, well-meaning Christians make is they're in too big of a hurry to share his story without first listening to their story and seeing where the Lord will intersect his story with their story. Because when people feel listened, when people feel heard, when people feel valued, and there's a relationship of trust with you, they are far more open to hear than if you just come from out of the blue, you saved brother. Now I'm using an extreme example, but you know what I mean. Unless the Lord has really put it on you, this is the right word now, that is normally not the way to start. I can go for ages in my coaching ministry, and I see it with the ministry, without mentioning the Lord's name. I have ethical boundaries that I can't cross there unless they raise it. It's amazing how often that happens if you go ahead. But even that, and even if it doesn't, I'm there going there, Lord, thank you for calling me to this ministry, and Lord, flow your light and love through me. Give me wisdom today. And there's more going on behind the scenes. Okay? But see, it's not all up to me. I can't save anyone. I can't save a fly's eyeball, but God can and will. It may just not be me, but who knows what other divine appointment he's going to set up with the person beyond you, beyond others. Okay? Do you understand what I'm saying? You're only part of the picture. It's about being obedient where we are. So God says, you know, Moses, who am I to do this? And the Lord says, I will be with you. The same promise that Jesus made to us. I will be with you always, even to the very end of the age. And by the way, Moses, this is who I am. I am who I am. And my name will be remembered throughout all generations. And God was faithful to that, and God was true, because we are hearing this word thousands and thousands and thousands of years after Moses heard it, and we are still worshipping a God whose name is to be remembered and will be remembered throughout all generations. And that is the hope, and that is the inspiration that comes to us to continue to listen to the burning bushes, to be available, to not look at our own perceived inadequacies, but step out in trust and obedience of what the Lord is going to do through you and me. Why? Because this is not the end. This is not a disaster. We keep hearing about, how bad things are. Well, they were pretty shocking back in ancient Egypt either as well. Okay? Whatever happens, yes, things are messy in this front here, but the God we worshipped is the same God whose name will be remembered throughout all generations, who is in control of this show, and his plans and purposes are going to be effected regardless of what is happening here. And the thing is, he could do it all himself, because he is the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-present God. He doesn't need you. He doesn't need me. He can do it perfectly well without us. And yet, this is the astounding, shocking truth, that in spite of our obnoxiousness, in spite of our rebelliousness, in spite of our lack of faithfulness, in spite of our capacity to just mess it up and go off on our own tangents, his love for us is so astonishingly great. His delight in us is so great that he's prepared to put up with that and still pour out his love on us and still use us, despite our imperfections, to partner with him in bringing about his transformation of this planet. Isn't that an incredible thought? So friends, Moses' story is our story. We just need to listen and look for the burning bushes to see what assignment he has next for us. Amen.